So the title of my talk is War as Embodiment of Evil, Debunking the Heroic Myths and Stress Testing Just War Theory. Since my lecture is in between the philosophical and more artistic sessions that we'll have in March, I decided to add some art to my talk as well. Besides, I believe that art is one of the brightest examples for my argument here. So I want you to take a look at this painting by Rubens. It is called The Consequences of War. We can see the figure of God of war, Mars, in the center. He is the core of the composition. On his left, we see Venus, the goddess of love, who tries to stop him. And on his right is a Fury, who drags him further into action. He is looking at Venus, but his sword is already dripping blood. We have other figures as well: mother scared for her child, fallen youth, woman in mourning, but they are secondary and they don't immediately attract one's attention. Yet the most crucial thing, I believe, is how war itself is depicted. It is embodied in a brave, muscular, absolutely handsome figure of not simply a hero, but a god. His armor is shining. He has no scars or mutilations. Moreover, he is adored by the most beautiful goddess of Olympus, basically an idol to follow. So the main question of my talk is, how did war move from this heroic, noble image to more evil in modern moral perception? To respond to this question, we will follow three steps. First, we'll ask how evil changed conceptually from metaphysical to embodied perspective. Then we'll see how war's heroic myth functions and persists in our time. And finally, we'll argue why just war theory fails in practice. Let's begin with a brief historical overview of the concept of evil. Of course, the concept of evil has a longer history that I present here. What I try to point out are the pivotal moments when the understanding of the concept somehow changed. I won't exaggerate it if I say that the notion of evil is as old as the world itself. Its roots go to the ancient proto-religious times when the world seemed so scary and incomprehensible. So the presence of evil as some malevolent entities was literally felt by our ancestors. Then it took shape and transformed into some metaphysical force or forces opposed to God or gods in plural. Within a monotheistic Christian context, it emerged as a distinctive conceptual problem, namely the problem of evil, which you already heard of in our first and second sessions of the lecture series. In their attempts to understand how a benevolent, omnipotent God could permit suffering in the world, Christian theologians, however, did not see evil as a central issue, and main focus was, of course, on God. Some, like St. Augustine, following Plotinus' doctrine, even went further to deny the existence of evil as a unique, separate essence by defining evil not as an independent force, but a privation of God's goodness. Evil, on Augustine's view, is nothing but a lack of life and light put by a creator when he made the world ex nihilo. Just like disease and wounds are nothing but an absence of health. Augustine's view was dominated into the early modern period, influencing philosophers like Descartes and Spinoza, before being challenged by thinkers like Leibniz with the development of the theodicy. Since we don't have time to talk about this in details, you can take a look at my paper, A Journey Towards a New Embodied Problem of Evil, that I've attached to this chat. I will only emphasize two significant aspects. First, under the long influence of Augustine, evil was examined primarily as a theological puzzle. And secondly, the nature of Augustinian answer that evil is a falling away from what is holy provided a justification for the notion of just war. Indeed, as Augustine claimed, one who is commanded by God to war does not kill himself. He is an instrument and a sword in the user's hand. Consequently, the commandment forbidding killing is not broken by those who have waged war on the authority of God. We'll see further that it was actually St. Augustine who developed the basis of just war theory. In the Enlightenment, philosophy and the Western world was secularized. So the question of God's control over evil faded, and the latter gradually became an ethical issue referring to human wrongdoing. The major figure here is Immanuel Kant, who discussed a propensity to radical innate evil in human nature that reveals itself in a form of the deliberate departure from the moral law to egoistic self-interest. In this way, Kant shifted the perspective from theocentric to anthropocentric model of evil. The emphasis was not on the ways that evil manifested itself within the human psyche, and the discussion shifted towards the intention-based view of evil, which is still prevalent in the contemporary psychology and popular discourse today. Although the emphasis was now on the human rather than the divine, the concept of evil on the Kantian view remained unembodied and focused on the perpetrator. The most important intellectual intervention on the concept, in my opinion, came from Hannah Arendt. While reporting on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, in whom Arendt marked the unexpected banality of evil. In The Man Who Sent to Death Millions of Jews, she did not observe a diabolic nature, but an awfully and terrifyingly normal functionary of the war machine who performed evil deeds without evil intentions. She described the chilling narrow-mindedness Eichmann exhibited doing his ordinary work. There are two aspects of Arendt's position. First, the unspeakable horror of the deed, and second, the undeniable ridiculousness of the man who perpetrated them. Both aspects of the equation marked a departure from the previous attempt to understand evil. First, the view of evil as unspeakable horror marks a turn to thinking of evil in a narrow sense, relating specifically to the extreme forms of wrongdoing, rather than in the wide concept relating to the wrongdoing in general that St. Augustine and Kant used. With regard to banality, the fact that Eichmann was so unthinking and ordinary marked a turn away from the intention-based approach to evil, to a thin account of evil, as we discussed it in the previous talk with Dr. Wilby last week. Namely, the accent shifted from an evildoer who acts out of malice and with sadistic pleasure to an evildoer who knows, at least on some level, that he is acting wrongly. In the contemporary philosophy, there has been a revival of attempts to define evil in practical terms, prompted by Arendt's insight. A prominent example is Claudia Card's atrocity paradigm, which grounds the concept of evil in the context of atrocities. She wrote 2 books on the topic. The first one is Atrocity Paradigm, the Theory of Evil, and the second one, that is a continuation of her thoughts, Confronting Evils, Terrorism, Torture, and Genocide. Claudia Card defines evil as foreseeable, intolerable harms produced by culpable in the first book, and in the second book she changed it to inexcusable wrongdoing, and emphasizes that the severity of the harm done rather than the perpetrator's psychological state is what distinguishes an evil act from ordinary act. According to her view, what makes an action evil is the magnitude of the suffering and deprivation, the catastrophic impact it inflicts on victims. In other words, evils are those wrongs that tend to devastate the life of the others. Such a definition directs attention to the existence and conditions of those who suffer rather than searching for the mysterious reasons for God to allow evil or motives of the perpetrator. Moreover, by defining evil through the culpability of the wrongdoer, Card approach also clarifies what does not count as evil. First, like natural disasters, which were once viewed as evil in theological debates, since there is no culpable agency that is involved, they cannot be moral atrocities, but only tragedies. Similarly, harm that results from genuinely blameless accidents, like a driver who had a heart attack or fainted and crashed in another car, it won't be classified as evil despite their negative outcomes, because evil requires a conscious and deliberately negligent wrongdoer behind the act, as in Eichmann's case. Thus, taking the victim-centered perspective, Card's concept of evil become truly embodied. By foregrounding the standpoint of victims and the real-world harm done, Card's atrocity paradigm shifts moral analysis from the intentions in the evildoer's mind to the damage in the world that evildoers cause. It shifts the significant advantages. First, it captures human intuitive judgments of evil. What horrifies us about genocide or serial killings is not primarily the mindset of the killer, but the suffering and destruction they inflict. Beyond the sheer fact of this suffering, Card's paradigm does not reflect on the nature of the victims, their innocence or their merit, asking if they deserve the suffering falling on their fate or if it served some purpose, as the problem of evil sometimes does, because no one should have to suffer atrocities regardless of individual character. Card focuses on intolerable and often irreparable outcomes, making clear why evil are morally worse. In this way, her view ties the concept of evil to human lived experience. Second, it avoids excusing or downplaying harms due to perpetrator's self-rationalization or lack of malicious intent. Arendt's account of Eichmann is particularly intrusive in this regard. Eichmann did not have a satanic hatred toward Jews. He was a bureaucrat whose banal motives like careerism and conformity enabled industrial-scale slaughter. An intention-based view might struggle to label Eichmann evil despite the gruesome consequences of his ordinary work, since he was consciously malevolent in the caricatured sense. Yet clearly, the effect of his actions were among the greatest evils in history, and it is the victim's perspective that highlights the evil of his deeds, not the inner state, whether it might have been. Third, it emphasized two things in our moral reasoning about evil. First, the embodiment of the victims, and second, the empathy of the outlooker. It forces us to consider that the suffering creatures are individuals of flesh and blood, like we are, rather than abstract of villainous or heroic archetypes, which has crucial ethical importance. Since by understanding evil by the extreme suffering it causes, we acknowledge the moral priority of elevating and stopping it. Moreover, by implementing this approach, we treat those who have been harmed not as mere footnotes to a philosophical puzzle or statistic in a graph or unknown causalities, but as a nucleus of understanding what moral catastrophe truly means. In sum, defining evil in terms of atrocities emphasizes the embodied dimension of the caused harm and the role of the wrongdoer, providing clear, pragmatic, and ethically salient account to the concept. Let's swiftly continue with the second part of our talk, because we already spent too much time talking about evil. So for the millennia, warfare was idealized as a noble endeavor. Apart from the frequent and familiar glorification and idealizations of the warriors in literature, from ballads to chivalric romances and classical writings from Virgil to Shakespeare, philosophy took over too. Homeric epic glorified war heroes on both sides of the battlefield, from the martial virtues of courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. Just recall Achilles and Hector in the Iliad. In Plato's Republic, warrior athletes play a central role in the ideal city put in the middle class between the vice philosopher king and the civilians. Niccolo Machiavelli, impressed by the Spartans, went even further in his Discourse on Levi, promoting the idea of citizen soldiers, emphasizing that good soldiers of Sparta were worth more than the industry and the money of Athens. Respectively, he saw war as an unavoidable event, merely a way of living in a world as common as times of peace, stating in The Prince that a ruler must never stop thinking about war and preparing for war, and he must work at it even more in peacetime than in wartime itself. Even Hegel deemed war to be a necessary condition of national vitality that actualizes the particular of temporal things, seeing it in a higher significance that preserves the ethical health of the nation. These are only a bunch of examples that already demonstrate how deeply the heroic myth of war was integrated in the Western philosophical thought. Apart from literature and philosophy, the other reason for such utopian treatment of war could be found in just war theory, which states that war could be morally justified if a just cause died with the correct conduct. According to this tradition, war, also regrettable, can become a permissible lesser evil or even an honorable matter, like bellum sanctum, as a Catholic Church led by Pope Urban II saw it. According to the prominent and popular line of historical thinking, just war theory was preceded by an older warrior ethos that might be called honorary war theory. This was the idea that war is sometimes can and should be fought nobly, honorably, and heroically. Such a code glorified war as a series of noble adventures and deeds of arms carried out of splendidly mounted and armed knights in the hope that brave men should be inspired to follow such examples. As Margaret Macmillan highlights, medieval chivalric codes of honor merely served to cast a sheen of glamour and nobility over the reality of bloody wars. Let's quickly take a look at two works of art. Here we have a painting of Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon, who is depicted like Mars in Rubens' picture, a proud, victorious hero illuminated by his glory and power and the future of the world that he is carrying in his hand. Even death in this picture is visually beautiful. Just look at this white angel-like figure spread out under the horse hoop. And on this fresco, one second. Yeah. The devastations are more massive, but still not visually captivating. The heroic image of the Roman Emperor Constantine I with angels over his head, meaning that he has God's support in this battle, having all the light on him, attracts all our attention. However, the situation changed with the arrival of the 20th century. Just look at these two pictures and you will understand what I'm talking about. You will never look at Hitler the same way you look at Sir John Hilbert, even though they're almost identically represented in those two images. So there were three pivotal turns in the 20th century. First was the World War I, with its dreadful swarms of Passchendaele hinted at the futility and horror of the modern mass warfare, and the use of first gas for the mass killing was also really devastating. Then the Second World War fully exposed how destructive and morally catastrophic war can become. Total war engulfed entire populations, mass murders and genocides, entire city reduced to rebels, and the first use of nuclear weapon on civilians. Every single thing on this list marked the point of non-return. Thus, the post-war intentional order attempted to codify a new understanding of war as a crime to be prevented in the future. The Nuremberg trials declared that war of aggression is a supreme international crime, different only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. Look how the representation of war in the art changes. Losing a heroic aura, it becomes embodied in the nameless figures of average people. It could be your father, your friend, or even you yourself who might take their places. Look at those soldiers. Their backs are bent by the weight of the unbearable burden. All of them all they can do is march on without seeing a bright future somewhere on the horizon, the future that might signify the end of their suffering. They seem to stuck in the stretch here and now moment that can easily become the last one in their lives. War makes the millions of soldiers lose their faces, becoming a tragic statistics of casualties. And even this finally shows itself in all its horrible appearance, not hidden behind the angelic light or on the contrary in the shadows and somber colors at the background. Moreover, the figures of civil victims of war become at last visible. My personal favorite painter, Tamara Lempicka, was a Polish Jew who on her own skin felt the horror of forced immigration. And the last image is in this series is Picasso's massacre in Korea that happens 5 years after the Second World War and depicts a mass killing of South Korean refugees by US soldiers. Look at those soldiers. They completely lost their human traits, as if they had grown together with their guns. At last, we can go to the ultimate question of our lecture, which is what is wrong with the just war theory? So just war theory is built on two pillars that take roots in Christian philosophy, being developed by St. Augustine, who, as you remember, argued that evil does not exist. In his City of God, he pointed out two core principles of just war. First, just ad bellum, meaning just cause to start the war. And he emphasized that war must be declared by a proper authority, it must have a right or good intention, and be a last resort. And the second one is jus in bello, meaning just conduct in war. Namely, that war must comply with the principles of proportionality, that the force used must not be excessive, and distinction between combats and civilians. After the horrors of the 20th century, the contemporary just war theory scholars added the third pillar, which is jus post bellum, meaning justice after war, which should provide terms for the end of war and guidelines for peace treaties, political reconstruction, environmental remediation, war crime trials, and war reparation. I argue that two distinct issues arise that challenge the coherence of just war framework. First, the concept of jus ad bellum has historically been vulnerable to manipulation by political leaders who use moral language for propaganda purposes. History is full of examples of the exploitation of justice in the name of something bigger. Crusades claimed to protect Christendom by liberating the Holy Land, concealing the goal of strengthening the geopolitical authority of the Roman Empire, Roman Church, and taking control over profitable trade routes to the east. European empires spoke of civilizing cultural missions as they conquered foreign lands while actively taking advantage of the seized goods. In more recent years, Adolf Hitler declared that his invasion of Poland was a defensive retaliation, going so far as to stage a false flag attack, the Glavich incident, to justify his aggression. Likewise, in 2022, Vladimir Putin portrayed Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a denazification mission with aim to protect Russian-speaking civilians, involving World War II imagery as if they are fighting the just war against fascism. Second, the principle of jus in bello does not stand up to the realities of war, and if no war can be fought without violating jus in bello, then the very concept of just war is called into question. There are various reasons why the violation of jus in bello might occur, many of which are not down to the straightforward disregard of the rules of war. For instance, the My Lai massacre during the Vietnam War has been argued to be at least partially traceable to pure communication of military leadership. Moreover, if those fighting against aggression even those who fight against aggression can commit serious wrongs in the process of war. An atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed at once more people than any armed ever could. Thus, even when war seems remarkably consistent with these principles, the moral picture can remain catastrophic once one widens the frame to include the aftermath. Take an example of Gulf War that is often considered the most illustrative example of the just war. Given the enormous number of powerful bombs dropped, the targeting of military assets located in or near cities, there were still a large number of civilian casualties. These civilian deaths were not an unintended side effect, but foreseeable consequences accepted in the name of the minimization of coalition casualties. Speaking in an informal way, the life of a mother and child, an older couple, or a group of teens were considered wars taken to prevent the possible death in a battle of an allied soldier. The question is whether such a calculation just. Therefore, as a third point, I want to highlight that even truly defensive wars generate evils and therefore are morally impossible with a just war theory. Classical just war doctrine holds that defensive war against aggression as just and lawful, and I don't disagree with one's right to defend oneself when attacked. The tragedy, however, is that while all parties involved in the war are doomed to commit moral wrongs, because wars always unleashes forces beyond one's full control. The persistent belief that war can, in the modern era, be righteous crusades fought by honorable heroes for the just cause in a just manner is not only a distortion, it's a dangerous fiction. The politics should abolish first the mentality backed by just war theory, This mentality which lies the ground for the imperialist ambitions, and instead of finding the reasons to coexist and prosper together in peace, it searches for the just reason to wage the war. Some may still argue that defensive war might be better than alternative. The truth is that the war to be defensive on one side, it should be aggressive on the other. If there is no aggression, there is no need to defend oneself. In other words, the point is not in Christian, do not resist an evil person and turn the other cheek, but to not confuse the political necessity of defense with the moral utopian idea of a just war. And I believe that an understanding of war as an embodiment of evil led us to debunk the heroic myths laden in the just war theory and helps make vivid the necessity for abolition. Thank you for your attention.